I'm Abe, and I run a vintage clothing store in Shimokitazawa, Tokyo. Nice to meet you. Our store mainly stocks items from the 1950s up to more recent times, and we purchase what I personally like from America and sell them here. When I was thinking about the name of the store, I imagined and considered many cool names, but in the end, when I go to America, do my own buying and sell the products, I thought that using my own name for the brand name would be the easiest to understand. It's not like vegetables, but you know how the producer's name is written on vegetables and things sold at the supermarket, right? In that sense, I thought it would be best to use my own name in order to be proud of the fact that I am the one doing the buying and selling. So I decided to use the name Abesho, which is short for Abeshoten, as the official brand name for the store to create a unique and memorable identity. During my senior year of university, I wasn't really job hunting, but I loved clothes. So I started working at a select shop and observed new clothes. After leaving that job, I realized I didn't know much about vintage clothing, so I started working at a vintage clothing store. I worked at a vintage clothing store, but it was a vintage store, so they only had vintage clothing, and the store had its own specific vibe. When I worked at the select shop before that, I had always liked new brands and designer items. Just vintage clothing was not satisfying enough. To be satisfied working there, I wanted a store where both designer items and vintage clothing could be part of the merchandise, something I would see every day. Back then, about 20 years ago, there weren't many vintage clothing stores that mixed vintage American casual wear with designer brands like Comme des Garçons, which we also carry in our store now. So I decided to start my own store, that's why. As for this place, Shimokitazawa, I was born in Kanagawa, but I went to a high school in Tokyo, and it was a private clothing high school. So on my way from my home to high school, I would transfer at Shimokitazawa station, and on my way home from school, I would go vintage shopping with friends. I've been going to vintage clothing stores since I was a teenager. I know there are many meccas for vintage clothing such as Gwenji and Harajuku, but since I was familiar with the area and had been going there for a long time, I decided to set up my store in Shimokitazawa. When it comes to stocking items, Shimokitazawa has many vintage clothing stores with various genres. So, one of the key points I make sure to focus on is avoiding the habit of watching YouTube or browsing Instagram to check what products other stores are stocking or how they are presenting their merchandise. Therefore, my approach is genuinely guided by intuition. While I certainly have a strong appreciation for vintage items, I also ensure that I only purchase and offer new items that I instinctively feel a strong connection to and am genuinely excited about. Kei-kun and Tuma-kun were originally our customers. When they first started visiting the store, I had no idea what kind of work they were involved in, or even what kind of people they were. But as I got to know them through conversations, I discovered that they were engaged in car service work, and one of them was a hairdresser and makeup artist. It seemed like they took a liking to our store's basic vintage clothing and other items, and eventually they became quite fond of and enthusiastic about what we offered. Before Kei-kun got involved, one of our part-time staff members, who has since joined the buyer team at Beams, helped us by creating a lookbook. Following that, Kei-kun approached me and asked, "Does Abe-san have someone exclusively handling your lookbooks?" To which I replied, "No, not at all. We've always wanted to collaborate with people we felt were right for the moment or project. That's been the ideal approach for us." When Kei-kun expressed his interest in working on our lookbooks, this place is located in one of the relatively older parts of Shimokitazawa. Right outside the store, you'll find the Ichiban Gai shopping street, and Abesho is situated near the far end of that street. It's tucked away in a side alley, making it a very quiet and peaceful spot. For the entrance, we've installed a vintage door that we specifically sourced. To me, the door is a kind of checkpoint, something I think of as marking the transition between the outside and the inside. The world outside the store and the one inside feel entirely different to me. When you open the door, it makes a distinct clicking sound, and when you close it behind you, it clicks again. This sound represents the moment you step from the outside world into the interior of the store. It's not like you're entering a completely different world, but I want our customers to consciously sense that they are stepping into a new space. I want their mindset to shift as they enter, allowing them to fully immerse themselves in the atmosphere of the shop and enjoy the unique items we have to offer. That's why we chose to install such a sturdy and distinctive door. Now let's take a look inside. Here's the inside of the store. As you can see, we have Garfield dolls displayed prominently throughout. While we don't have a large selection of vintage clothing, the store has a unique vibe. Over here, on this wall, we have vintage paintings displayed in a distinctive and eye-catching way. When you enter the store, the rack on the right side is where I keep basic items. These are pieces from our vintage collection that are easy to pick up and wear. Among these basics, you'll find Ralph Lauren swing top jackets, which are timeless classics. The sizes are a bit oversized, and what makes these particular pieces stand out is that the body and embroidery are the same color. This subtle design choice makes the iconic pony logo less noticeable, which, in my opinion, makes these jackets easier to wear casually. I personally like them so much that I even wore one today, which inspired me to stock them for our customers. Now, about myself. I've been bald for quite a while, and because of that, I've come to think of hats almost as if they were wigs. This personal connection to hats is why I have such a strong affection for them. Modern hats have great designs, sleek shapes, and cool prints, and I appreciate them for what they are. However, I'm especially drawn to vintage American caps. As you can see, their shapes can be quite odd, with crowns that stand up awkwardly or structures that are simply imperfect. But it's precisely that imperfection that I find so charming. At first glance, they may seem hard to wear, but once you put them on, they create a slightly puffed or uneven look that feels adorably and uniquely uncool. I find that subtle awkwardness to be incredibly appealing. Of course, we also stock more well-known and mainstream caps, but I've made a point to include less conventional ones that might make you pause and wonder about them. To me, these quirky caps epitomize the character of American vintage. Next, let me talk about this wall. At first glance, it might look like these are pieces of art, but they are actually all paper napkins. Some feature Van Gogh designs, while others like these are prints from Playboy magazine from around the 1950s. Paper napkins are items that, in extreme cases, are simply used to wipe your mouth and then thrown away. They are disposable and often discarded without a second thought, vanishing entirely once they've served their purpose. What we've done here is source these napkins as dead stock items, frame them, and sell them as decorative pieces. I believe that items like this are quite rare in Japan. They have a distinctly American charm, which is why I decided to source and present them in this unique way. Well, these items here are from all sorts of different eras. Something like this Garfield piece, that's a more recent thing. But these Van Gogh prints, they're like from the 60s, like on paper napkins, and then some Playboy items, and then animal designs. You know, as we get into more recent times, the prints themselves become incredibly cute. The vintage prints of animals, the artwork, they're kind of realistic, aren't they? Like realistic in a way, but they have a certain charm. And next up, here's this rack. Well, this rack is what I consider my challenge section. I try to put out the most unique and interesting vintage clothes I can find here. Like some of these military pieces with hand-painted designs, like someone actually painted them on. You know, in vintage clothes, we often see damaged items, and those are cool too. But even with some newer, more recent items like this Carhartt, it's clear that someone has replaced the zipper themselves, like someone repaired it and wore it until it was really worn out. It gives off that feeling of being loved. So even with newer things, if they have this kind of damage, that sort of American feel, we get those in stock. And Right now, I think damaged items like these are quite interesting, and that's what's on display here. And next up is this one over here. This rack, on the other hand, is more of a place where I'm putting items that I'm really feeling lately, the things I really want to suggest to people. In particular, what really influenced me last year was seeing the Adidas x Balenciaga collection runway shows. Things like these sports brands items, up until now, the power of their logos was so strong, I never wore them. They really weren't part of my daily wardrobe. But after seeing that collection, I started to try and incorporate these kinds of fashion and sports brand items into my own wardrobe. And as I looked at various items, I came to think that things like this sweatshirt with the nylon accents, the way the materials are used, the color schemes, things from the 90s era, they were really daring and interesting, and I started collecting them. Also the silhouettes, the wide fit, the shorter length. To be frank, it's the kind of silhouette that Demna at Balenciaga is doing. It really fits the times. The black and white color scheme is so cool in a very fashion forward way. It's really cool, isn't it? Even now I think it's great, and the comfort of wearing sports brand clothing is so great. Before I knew it, I'd collected so many. And next up is this one. This section is more like my mode section. I put the cool, fashionable clothing here. To speak like a vintage clothing store would, we have items like this cashmere 100% Chester coat from around the 60s. It has the Union ticket on it. While we have some older coats, of course, we also have pieces like this Comme des Garçons coat in my own personal collection. You know, I think it's important to touch the textures of this Comme des Garçons coat and the texture of the cashmere wool of these older coats, and by comparing the materials and the silhouettes of vintage and modern clothes, if people could try them on and really experience it, I think it would be great. That's why I put them out. Especially now it's all black, I'm consciously trying to keep it all black to really give off that high fashion mood. And now inside the shop, this is the display case next to the counter. Here we have what's known as Mexican silver rings, spoon rings that were made from actual spoons, spoon rings from around the 70s, and some Tiffany jewelry. More recently, this Cartier gold ring also came into stock. And college rings, military vintage rings and bracelets all over the place. There's an especially large amount of American school rings, graduation class rings from high schools and colleges, college rings from different years. There are 100 of them in this one case, and things with different materials, class rings, college rings made with actual gold. We have a lot of those here too. I don't think there are many vintage clothing stores that have this many college rings, so I think it's something that people will find really worth looking at. And these eyeglasses, the eyewear, it's the same even for vintage clothing stores. You just don't find this level of selection very often. We don't just take things we've bought from America and put them right on display. We polish them first, make adjustments, even apply heat. They're not quite the same as new eyeglasses, but we carefully select items that can be used in everyday life. You can take them to an eyeglass store and have the lenses changed. Those are the kind of things we have for sale. And in terms of age, we have items like these from American Optical from the 60s, and these USS pieces, which are military surplus that were supplied to the armed forces. There are also frames with distinctive, interesting square lenses. We even have some dead stock items here. You just don't see this sort of selection very often in Tokyo. I think they're interesting pieces. Because I've got bad eyesight myself, I'm very particular about the good pieces of eyewear that I select. And in the case in the center of the shop, we have a whole array of silver bracelets and necklaces. Mostly it's newer stuff from the 80s and on, but we do have items like this, these DNA bracelets, which are made of Mexican silver with a slightly different, heavier feel. And conversely, not Mexican things, we also have these Figaro necklaces. These are made of Italian silver. We have a mix of Italian pieces. There are a lot of variations. This is also something that is really worth seeing. I highly recommend them. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. We also make some of these items. They're basically remakes. We use the North Face Steep Tech fabric to make these pieces. The thing I value the most when making remakes is the idea of bringing back something that has reached the end of its life as a piece. You know, for example, if you look at this, the North Face Steep Tech jacket with older items, things with really high performance, the interior can degrade, you get white powder and smells, and things that people can't wear anymore and just throw out. And we take these things, try to give them a new life, allow the item to have a new purpose. I'm always thinking about how we can do that when we choose our materials. And one example of that is the North Face Steep Tech fabric for these bags and hats. To be honest, the lining is new, but other than that, other than the lining and the thread, we use the North Face fabric to remake these items. You know, with this Steep Tech, the item itself, the fabric itself, the jacket itself is so interesting, especially the zippers all over it. I try to make the most of these logos in our designs. Also, this bag, we talked with the North Face about this last spring, and there's a video about it on the North Face Instagram page. It came up in that discussion. This was originally a jacket, a piece of clothing, but this one was a tent. We used tent fabric. Tents are also high performance items, but as they get used, they degrade, they might leak. They are also things that end up getting thrown away. So by taking the tent and turning it into a bag, when you go camping again, you can put your camping gear inside. Even things that have been used up can be turned into bags, so you can bring them along with you camping again. It's fun to think of that, so I made these. I love vintage clothing, but if you walk around areas like Shimokitazawa and Quenji, there are a lot of people wearing vintage clothes, right? In places like Shibuya, Harajuku, and Shinjuku, there really aren't that many people wearing vintage clothing. Depending on the area, you'll see hardly anyone at all. And I don't mean to be rude when I say the countryside, but in cities outside of Tokyo, you just don't see a lot of people fully dressed in vintage clothes. And honestly, I don't think there are many people who mix vintage and new clothing. Lately, vintage is becoming more popular, and I think the awareness of it will continue to increase. But I'd really like more people to pick up and try vintage clothing, so I want to keep putting the word out there. And my own personal dream is that when I was a junior in college, I wanted to become a designer and went to a night school for designers after finishing university. But I was just so bad at drawing, I gave up the idea of becoming a designer after only 6 months in that school. Things just kind of happened, you know. Back then, since I wanted to be a designer, I also really liked designer brand clothing. So as it happened, my dream is to have my own store where I make remakes and sell vintage clothes because I also love vintage. I want it to be like the Tokyo collection, a runway where the vintage clothes are put out on display, like the looks we do with Kay. We always ask Kay to do these lookbooks using vintage and remade pieces, and I want to show vintage clothing on a runway to show that it's more than just old used clothing, more than just antiques. I want to get the fashion aspect across.